Thank you, Felice. Thanks to everybody for joining us this evening and to CAM's supporters and trustees. I'm very honored to be able to introduce my colleague Lynne Cooke this evening. Cooke is the Senior Curator of Special Projects in Modern Art at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., where her exhibition Outliers and American Vanguard Art is currently on view. More on that exhibition in a moment. Prior to her position at the National Gallery, Cooke was the Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the Museo Nacional de Arte Reina Sofía in Madrid from 2008 to 2012, and the Curator of the Dia Art Foundation in New York from 1991 to 2008. Cooke's exhibitions have also been seen at the Hirschfeld Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C., the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the New Museum and the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and the Serpentine Gallery in London. And many of you who are Houstonians may know that she currently has an exhibition, the Fabiola Project, on view at the Menil's Byzantine Fresco Gallery. Cooke's current National Gallery exhibition, Outliers in American Vanguard Art, is the first major exhibition to explore key moments in American art when avant-garde and outsider artists intersected. It considers how these interchanges ushered in new paradigms for art based on inclusion, integration, and assimilation. In her essay for the show's catalog, Cooke notes that self-taught, a term that is most popularly used right now, is capacious if indefinite, and that other monikers identifying the dizzying number of subsets, including folk, modern primitive, naive, visionary, vernacular, isolate, outsider, and more, all present their own problems and inadequacies. These are issues, I think, that are very germane to our current exhibition, Christopher Knowles, in a Word. The exhibition was curated by Chief Curator Anthony Elms and Guest Curator Hilton Alves for the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, and I coordinated its presentation here at CAM. Knowles received no formal artistic training, but it's clear for any of you that have a chance to look at this exhibition that he's indeed produced an engaging and nuanced body of work that rewards our attention. So, in order to kind of solve this problem, Cooke has introduced another inventive term, outlier, into the artistic nomenclature. This palliative, she notes, quote, sidesteps questions of inside versus outside in favor of distances nearer and farther from an aggregate, so that being at variance with the norm can be a position of strength, a place negotiated or sought out rather than predetermined or fixed. Lynne's work is colored by a mixture of compelling critical acumen, foresight, and generosity, and I'm so pleased to be able to introduce her this evening. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Dean, for a very generous introduction. And I just want to say how pleased I am to be able to see this remarkable show. It speaks some of the issues it raises speak very much to questions I've been thinking about in making the exhibition Dean referred to, Outliers in American Vanguard Art. What I thought I'd do tonight is talk about that show indirectly and break the talk down into three parts, looking at moments in the interwar years when a paradigm for dealing with self-taught art of various types, from folk to naive to visionary, was worked through by Alfred Barr at the Museum of Modern Art in a way that is totally remarkable and has been completely forgotten. And then turn to the 70s, the second half of the century, when the idea that much of this art was incommensurable really took hold. And it took hold under the term outsider, which was the English language equivalent to a term art brut, coined by the French artist Jean Dubuffet, who thought that the art of people who were institutionalized because they had mental and developmental disabilities, or people in prison, or other social alienates, he might have said, that this work was so beyond the knowable. It was remarkable, but it couldn't be put into dialogue with canonical mainstream art made by individuals who'd been formally trained in academies, who had an understanding of art history and art traditions, and who saw their production in relation to those canonical mainstreams. And for Dubuffet, who made this enormous collection, which now resides in Lausanne, it was impossible to see mainstream work in relation to this, and it denigrated the work of the self-taught artist. And he stipulated that the work in this institution he founded could be loaned, but it could never be lent to institutions that wanted, like museums of modern and contemporary art, that wanted to put it in dialogue with work by trained artists. So that's a very extreme position, but it's not one that that he held alone. And I will look at this briefly and then come to the question of what do we do now? How do we address work made by people who would, in traditional modernist terms, be seen as marginals? People on the outside as distinct from the inside. If the center is occupied by the vanguard and the authoritative institutions who write the narratives of modern art, then these different groups of marginalized others are often sources of inspiration, but they have a dependent relationship in a hierarchical power structure. They never have agency in this modernist formulation. If we want to reject that, what are alternatives? So I will quickly go through these two historical arguments in order to get us to the current debate. But I want to start with a quote from the critic Harold Rosenberg, writing in 1974, as he reviews a show of historic American folk art, that is, work made really up to the Industrial Revolution, and including an example like this on the left, which you can see was a point of inspiration for Roy de Forest, who is an artist who lived in the Bay Area, and who's in a very kind of witty way taken the courting or the kind of sexual relations in the early work made in Pennsylvania in the 18th century as license to rethink it in his own language with his own set of nuances. So Rosenberg, writing in 74 of an exhibition called The Flowering of American Folk Art at the Whitney, says, "Folk art of whatever state has become modern art." And this is a really curious statement, or reading it subsequently. He's not saying folk art has been the source of inspiration, which clearly we can see, and we're familiar with that idea. He's saying it is modern art. It's not separate and coming from the margins. It's somehow within the narratives of modern art. So that's my starting point. And so I want to turn to the immediate years after the First World War, when American vanguard artists who'd been in Europe came back with the outbreak of war and left behind, in a sense, their interest in Cubism and post-impressionist styles, and were turned inward in the wake of the Armory show and began to think about the question of what an American art was. What distinguished American art? How could it have its own identity rather than being endlessly dependent on European models, which you could say had been the case for American art really since it got going in several hundred years before. And in looking to answer this question, which quickly became a cultural question, question about American identity in a larger sense than simply an argument for visual artists. The source was thought to lie in folk art traditions, and that if American artists looked to limmer paintings, looked to weather vanes and folks and shop signs and whirligigs and the like, they would find a means to make a distinctively American art. And for many of them, this was not difficult in the sense that an artist like Kuniyoshi, who was academically trained, saw in a painting like this one from the early 19th century formal affinities with his own way of working. He saw in the simplification and abbreviation of forms, the craftsmanship, in the flattening of the picture space, a set of compositional, structural, and formal decision-making that was really commensurate with his own. So rather than undergoing an enormous shift in style, it was more an embrace of likeness. And so in 1924, the Whitney, which is a very young institution at this time, asks an artist to put together a show of folk art objects that he and his friends, like Kuniyoshi, had been collecting. And it's this show, which includes this painting of Miss Van Allen, which is a much admired painting by artists at the time, that really turns the tide. And for the first time, historic folk objects, which until then you could find in junk stores and attics and the like, were reconsidered in aesthetic terms. So those arguments are really essentially nativist arguments. As I said, they occupy the immediate aftermath of the First World War in the 20s as the country goes through an isolationist policy in terms of political positions. Immigration laws are tightened, and a sense of looking to a usable past preoccupies cultural producers of many kinds. Almost immediately that he takes up his position as director of the Museum of Modern Art, which was founded in 1929, Alfred Barr, the director, takes a very different position. And he too looks at the work of what were called folk artists at the time, but rather than looking at historic figures and often anonymous artifacts, he looks at living makers of folk and naive and visionary art. And he does so in order to make a very different argument. And that is that one of the tributaries of modern art is a tributary of that constitutes work by the modern primitive. And by primitive, he's referring to untrained and marginalized and outside knowledge of academic traditions. And so it could also, primitives also was a big category that could also include tribal objects, the work of children, the work of schizophrenics, Mesoamerican sculpture and the like. Very, very broad, very capacious. But the modern primitive is someone of the recent past or living present, like Henri Russo, who for him is the doyen of this, is the touchstone for this kind of work. And Barr makes the argument that this is an international phenomenon and it needs to be recognized along with and made visible to his audiences in exhibitions, along with the shows of surrealism, cubism, and abstract art, Bauhaus, and the like, that he's producing at the time. And so I show you, in a sense, a reconstruction of works that were part of an exhibition he made in 1938 to exemplify this position. So you see, this is from the show I've just organized, and you see paintings by Russo at the end, and you see other works that entered the Museum of Modern Art's collection from that. And I'll show you now some examples. And Barr's argument, as I said, was internationalist, that naive or self-taught or folk artists could be found in France and Switzerland and Germany, as well as North America, and there was nothing that distinguished the Americans in any significant way, or the Canadians, from their European peers. And so on the left you see a visionary artist, Patrick Sullivan, who made probably about a very small body of work, working painstakingly over the course of some 20 years later life, and a French artist who was much more renowned in Paris through the 20s and 30s. And in order to argue for this, Barr had made presentations to his trustees of what the museum should be showing and how the collection should be formed and what he saw as acquisition and programming policies. And what you see here are two different versions of what was called the Torpedo Diagram, in which he shows, in 1933, you see the kind of originary points of modernism as he understood it when he was 4 years into the job, and he's still thinking of Ingres and Goya and other European and non-European prototypes like Mesoamerican sculpture or tribal objects or the like as his starting point, but then he's gradually working up towards the present as all work that should be in the museum. By 1941, his vision has clarified and distilled, and he's cut off the starting point to post-impressionism, which is what we tend to think of as the beginnings of modernism today, and so influential was he in shaping our ideas of modern art. And in the adding to the group of the post-impressionists, Gauguin, Van Gogh, Seurat, and Cézanne, he's put Russo. He's put Russo because he thinks he is of that order. And this is something we would not tend to do today. But for Barr, Russo was as determining as any of those other four artists. And then he traces the movement forward. And as you can see, of course, it's already in the war has broken out in Europe, and he goes through the School of Paris, so all the interwar movements, the rest of Europe, and he sees now that the United States and Mexico have to lead the free world forward in terms of modern painting, vanguard painting. And of course, when he's talking about the States, you remember that many European artists who could had escaped from Europe and moved to New York and other parts in this country to carry on. And so in 41, in the year he makes that argument to the trustees, the museum opens its own new building for the first time, and for the first time he's able to have dedicated collection galleries. Up until that point, works in the collection were shown from time to time in an ongoing cycle of changing exhibitions. Now he has enough space to have collection galleries and then a section of the museum devoted to changing exhibitions. And the collection galleries are laid out as follows. This is where you start. And if you look closely, you can see that you start with some what we would call historic folk objects, American in this instance. The weather vane is the horse, a small sculpture, a painting by Pickett, a man called Joseph Pickett, from 1915, and on the wall on the right, I'll show you some more examples in a minute, but what you're looking for when you come into the first drill gallery, this is an annex into the first gallery with the dark wall, you're looking at a Russo painting and you're looking at a painting by John Cain, an American, who is sometimes called the American Russo, although his work is totally different. So there's the Pickett, and this is the Morris Hirschfeld Tiger, which is right on the immediate right. And there are two of the great Russos that are in the collection. And you can see it. So before you get to Cubism, before you get to Cézanne's Bather, this is where modern art starts. And I think that that will give, I hope, that will give you some sense of what Harold Rosenberg's talking about in 1974. He this venerable critic of the time, but he was someone who could remember the 30s and 40s in New York. He could remember Barr's program at a time when the Museum of Modern Art had put all of this work, except for the Russos, into storage, where it's remained in large part ever since. There's the cane. And I show you two examples of other works by Maurice Hirschfeld, because Hirschfeld's show was given a solo show in 1943. In 1942, there'd been a very large retrospective of Russo's work, so really consolidating the arguments I've been outlining. And what's remarkable about it in logistical terms was, because of the war, no works of art could be brought from Europe. It was too dangerous. And Barr said that the only major European artist that was possible to make a substantial retrospective of in the United States at that moment was Russo. He could not have done a Picasso show. He could not have done a Matisse show, because there were not good enough and sufficiently good examples in the country. But Russo's work had been so well collected and so esteemed, not only by institutions but by private collectors, that he could do a first-rate retrospective. And that will tell you something, again, about the positioning of that work in the country at the time, or at least in vanguard circles at the time. This was followed up in 43, so not much later, by a show devoted to the work of Maurice Hirschfeld, who had taken up painting on retiring from running a business as a slipper manufacturer. And Hirschfeld was in Brooklyn, and after painting one painting, he took it to the Brooklyn Museum to ask the curator of modern art there what he thought of it, and to get some career advice. He was obviously ambitious. He did not see himself as barred, bad pun, restricted from showing in contemporary art galleries, commercial galleries, or in museums for lack of training. And he could only have got that sense because of the climate of modern art in artistic circles at that moment. And whatever advice he got was good, because very quickly he was taken on by one of the leading commercial galleries at the time, and then Alfred Barr ushered in this show at the museum, which of course the trustees approved, and they acquired work. However, when the show actually opened, there was a storm. I mean, a real critical storm, and it came about for a number of reasons, I think. By 43, obviously nationalism and patriotism are very strong occurrence within the country. The museum had been doing war programming where it made exhibitions that referred to the war in different ways. And for critics in the city at the time, seeing this work was somehow a travesty. While they'd gone along with the exhibitions earlier and seeing the collection hung in a certain way, by 1943 it just no longer seemed appropriate, you could say. Of course, many contemporary American artists were also put out. They felt it was outrageous that a self-taught artist who'd been working for 4 years, should be given a solo show when others from their ranks were not so privileged. And the trustees lost faith, you could say. They began to think that this institution, which really was the high water mark, setting the standards for the collection and exhibition of modern art, had somehow lost its bearings. And as a consequence, Barr lost his position. And really, it's at that moment the tide turns in every sense. Not only does this 10-year campaign he's been on to position this work within the histories of modern art come to a rapid halt, many of these artists simply disappear from visibility. But there's one show that opened just before the Hirschfeld show that I want to point to as establishing this paradigm. It was called Americans 1943, as you can see, Realists and Magic Realists. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the programming was restricted if work couldn't be brought from Europe, and there was more American-centric programming than had been the case before. And what this show does is argue that there's a strain of realism or hyperrealism or magic realism that runs through American art. And so you see, as you entered the show, painting by Edward Hicks, one of the Peaceable Kingdom paintings, which are well known, which had been shown in 1938 in Barr's show about popular painters, self-taught painters. A painting by Thomas Cole of a kind of fantastical subject. A painting on glass by an unknown, probably a young woman being taught acquiring social skills, who would, that was kind of work they might do, working from stencils. There's the Cole. We see Cole today as precursor to the Hudson River Valley painters. A painting by Erastus Salisbury Field, extraordinary visionary, very large picture, an artist with no formal training. And we see the Sullivan again, now beside a reasonably well-known American surrealist. And so you see they're put in on a plane, on an even playing field, without distinction or apology, which is a phrase that Barr used. And it's this introduction of the even playing field and the introduction or the interweaving of work of this kind within larger narratives and histories of modern or American art that's unprecedented and that does not occur again really until the early 21st century. So I'm going to move quickly because I've taken longer than I intended to talk about the second half of the century. So when Harold Rosenberg makes this statement that folk art of whatever state has become modern art, he's talking about this big show of historic folk art at the Whitney, which was one of 3 shows the Whitney did beginning in 1974 when the director was a man called Tom Armstrong, who had come from colonial Williamsburg, where Abby Rockefeller, who was founder of the Museum of Modern Art, where her collection had gone along with other earlier material. And Armstrong is very interested in historic folk art. And he and his head of publications, Gene Lipman, who had collected it for decades, they go on this drive to position historic American folk art within the Whitney's purview. But their argument is really different as I read it. They're seeing historic folk art as cultural patrimony. And of course, in the 70s, as the bicentennial approaches, the Whitney takes on the mantle of being the custodian and champion of this work. And simultaneously, the Museum of Modern Art, as I said, had already consigned this work, the work that they had, to storage. They are rewriting their own history so that Barr's very ecumenical narratives of modern art get expunged, and a kind of reductive formalist modernism coming out of the arguments, theories, theses of Clement Greenberg in large part takes over and dominates the museum. So the Museum of Modern Art lets go of this, and the Whitney embraces it. But it embraces it not in internationalist modernist terms, but as I said, as American patrimony. Which means they're not really interested in 20th century self-taught work because it doesn't fit within a history that they want to see starting with folk art, which is somehow indigenous. I put that very deliberately in scare quotes, and then moves into American, the American histories we know of the Ashcan School and forward. And so although there had been small exhibitions in the Lobby Gallery in the early 70s of Joseph Joachim, who is a self-taught artist, who took up drawing in his 70s. He lived in Chicago, and he made these extraordinary visionary drawings of places, sites around the world which he had visited. Whether he'd visited them in actuality or in his imagination is not always clear. He certainly had traveled very widely. He also had books of with travel books and an Encyclopedia Britannica and other visual sources that confirmed and stimulated his visions. And they'd also shown the work of Minnie Evans, who was an African-American woman who lived on, who was the gatekeeper to a plantation in the South, and who began drawing again, prompted by God. And what she drew too were visions that came to her, albeit very different in type from Joachim's. And both of these shows took place in the 70s alongside these gigantic shows of historic folk art. But the Whitney does this twice and then it bows out, and it does these shows in the context of the aftermath of a controversy about the representations of African American art in the museum. So the contemporary show of African American work takes place in 1971. It is boycotted by many African American artists. Others who were part of it take their work out of it. And in the ensuing negotiations, the Whitney agrees to buy more work by African American artists and to do a series of shows in the lobby gallery. And curiously, I'll leave it at that, amongst the first shows they do are not the kind of activist, figurative work by artists who brought this dialogue into place, but they make 2 shows of self-taught work and a number of shows of abstraction. Also at this moment, coming from a different dynamic, is a growing interest not on the East Coast now, as in the early part of the century, but in the Midwest and in the South with self-taught work. And it's coming out of a really expanded moment in the art world when, in the wake of the counterculture, the civil rights movement, feminist, gay liberation movements, artists began to think outside the box more, to look for other modes of working, whether it's performance or photographically based or text-based. And as the materials and means that they choose to work in over, say, painting or sculpture, which tend to be seen as academic or inscribed with patriarchal values and the like, so their interest in the work of other artists outside canonical traditions broadens, and it leads to an interest both in artists working environmentally and artists working in the South in particular. So amongst the works that are given visibility at this time are a number of environments, mostly made in rural communities, but including the Watts Towers, which is recognized for the first time as an extraordinary creative achievement rather than an oddity, you might say. It's appreciated for its aesthetic qualities. And this work that was made in a garage over several decades probably by an African-American creator is discovered after his death and is acquired by the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, which is an extraordinary acquisition for the time, and really totally unexpected. And of course it's still there today. And it's, as you see the title, The Throne of the Third Heaven of the Nation's Millennial General Assembly, refers to, it seems, an idea that James Hampton has of a visionary future, a kind of different religious interpretation of a spiritual enlightenment, perhaps. And in concert with that, there's a show that shortly after opens at the Corcoran that brings together work by 20 self-taught African-American artists, mostly from the South, who made work that was often visionary. Sometimes that was in service to a religious mission, an evangelical mission. They were preachers. And sometimes for the interest of their community, as in the case of Sam Doyle, who takes up painting in later life, and he becomes the chronicler of his community. He's living on St. Helena Island off the Carolinas coast. He's a Gullah, and he paints mostly portraits, and often these are of people that he knows in his immediate neighborhood. They might be the first black embalmer on St. Helena, or the first spirit doctor, or the first teacher, and a number of other figures, including some of the greats in the African American pantheon, sports pantheon, like Joe Louis. And these he then puts on property he owns that fronts a major road, and he sells to people as they go by. So he's got a sense of being an artist and having a career, making work, and self-identifies as artist, and he clearly has agency. He's making the decisions, he's creating this pantheon of. In a different way, as did James Sanford Thomas, who had many different jobs, including being a gravedigger, and who also was a renowned blues musician. But in addition to that, Sanford Thomas made sculpture, again, mostly portrait heads. These are close to life size, from clay, which was not fired. And these he gave to friends, and over time, as the word spread, he started to sell to people coming by and to people interested in having them for their homes. Steve Ashby also took up making art late in life. This is a very common characteristic for many self-taught artists. And he worked with found materials photography, which he used to collage into assemblages. These works were largely collected after his death, so they're untitled, and it's a subject that clearly resonates today. At the same time, artists who'd been overlooked earlier on the work of these artists could be seen with new eyes. And Bill Traylor is an interesting case. He's probably one of maybe the most celebrated self-taught artist in this country. As you probably know, he was born a slave. He worked on a plantation. He then worked his own land for decades before moving to Montgomery when he was in his 80s and beginning to draw. And he drew for 3 years, or 3 and a bit years. And through a series of circumstances, the drawings were saved by a young white artist who was in Montgomery at the time, called Charles Shannon. And in 41, 42, Shannon sent a bunch of drawings to Alfred Barr because he thought he'd be interested in them. And Barr was. And he and some of his colleagues decided they'd acquire some works for their own collections, but Barr was not going to buy for the museum at that point. So, and at the same time, an exhibition was made at the Fieldston School in the Bronx by Victor D'Amico, who taught at the school, but was also the head of education at the Museum of Modern Art, of Traylor's work. So it was clearly of enormous interest and thought to be of significance. So when Barr sent Shannon a check. He didn't ask Shannon how much the drawings were. He simply sent him a check at whatever he valued them. And Shannon didn't take this lightly. He asked for the drawings back, he put them in his attic, and he looked after them for the next 30 years. And it was only in the late 1970s that they started to be shown again, firstly in galleries and then in museums. But the shifting climate is interesting to think about. Amongst the galleries that showed this work in the late 70s and early 80s was Hirschfeld and Adler. And if you think about what Hirschfeld and Adler, a very blue chip gallery, was showing, they were showing drawings by Joseph Beuys, by Louise Bourgeois. They were showing highly regarded work by really venerable figures. And Traylor's work, you can see, could fit in if you think about the works aesthetically. And so you get a completely different read on this work from the way it would have been seen. And I think Barr genuinely admired it, as did his colleagues. But they would have admired it in a context of other work made by self-taught artists at the time of a very different order. And that may explain why it didn't fit the collection, at least for them at that moment. But this raises one of the questions for curators who are working with collections and want to expand, to diversify, to be more inclusive in their histories of modern and contemporary art. Where do you put this in a collection? If you're at the Whitney, where would you put it? Do you put it in somehow along with artists of the 30s and early 40s who clearly knew nothing about it, and in turn Traylor had no sense, sense in the sense of no understanding, no cognizance of what was going on in museums on the East Coast, and clearly was indifferent to it? Do you put it into the 70s, late 70s and 80s, when now it's received and recognized as significant? Or do you wait and put it into the present when we don't tend to call these artists self-taught artists? We see them as artists without labels. It's really obviously a huge question, and the answer, of course, is there's no one right place. You make different kinds of decisions depending on what you're bringing out of storage to hang in the galleries and what kind of histories you're writing. There's no one history of American art. There are multiple histories. And it's works like this that position these arguments very vividly to curators working in institutions today. Another question that comes up, obviously, is how to contextualize works which not only were not at all made for galleries and museum context, they were not thought of as fine art objects like this wonderful text work of Jesse Howard's, but they belong to an environmental work. They're not autonomous artworks. And in the case of Howard's property, Sawhead Hill, in Fulton, Missouri, it no longer exists. I mean, his neighbors would have pulled it down had they had the opportunity while he was alive. Immediately he died. Some artists who knew the work from Kansas came and got it and looked after it. And it's through them and their efforts that the work that we have today exists. It simply had no value. In fact, his neighbors found him hectoring, obnoxious, and he was kind of pariah at the time. And this is one of many, many stories. So again, it raises the question, as we look at it as this fantastic text work, or at least I do, I think, again, how do we incorporate it? What kind of context and frame do we bring to it? So I will now move to a second thread that one might run through the 20th century. I've been talking about curators and institutions and exhibitions, because if you're thinking of work by self-taught artists and its reception in the 20th century in this country, it's going to have to come through institutions. That's how it enters the public arena. So the framework for the exhibition I organized, and really the framework for any histories you read of this material, is discussions of exhibitions. Because the museum acts and the curators act as the identifier, the classifier, the validator of this work. And it's once it enters the galleries and exhibitions that it enters a critical arena, and critical discourse happens around it. There was no other place for it and to be seen, no other vehicle. Now books, of course, are written by academics that rewrite the history of American art. We have universities across the country with American studies and American art history departments. There were no departments of art history teaching modernism in the early 20th century. It was not being written in institutions by scholars. It was being written in museums by curators who sometimes had some training in the field, but often not. They worked through passion and teaching themselves and putting together the history brick by brick. But the other thread that one could look at is the advocacy of trained artists for the work of their of autodidacts, whom they regarded as their peers. So while the museums are trying to classify it and bring it under different terms, as Dean mentioned earlier, a whole heteronomy of isolate, modern primitive, folk, outsider, transgressors, and the like, most of the trained artists who were interested in this material embraced it without labels. This was simply work by artists. And one of the kind of most powerful figures who galvanized the reception of self-taught work in the 70s was a Chicago artist called Jim Nutt. And he and a coterie of his peers, Gladys Nielsen, Barbara Rossi, and others, first saw the work of Joseph Joachim that I showed you shortly before in a storefront where Joachim was living. And they were astonished that there could be someone living in their midst whose work was remarkable. They said it's like finding Russo in your backyard. And when Nutt, who went to Sacramento for his first teaching job in 1968, again through an extraordinary set of circumstances, he came across work by Martin Ramirez and brought the work of Joachim to the attention of his immediate circle there, and then more broadly to the Bay Area, to figures like Roy DeForest, whom I showed you at the beginning. But what you see here is the first show, one of the first shows that Nutt had on the West Coast, and really one of the first in his career. It's a 3-part show where he persuaded the director of the Candy Store, which was a small gallery in Sacramento, to not only show his work, but to show Gladys Nielsen's and Joseph Joachim's together. And you can see this is the poster for the show, and the title is 3 Famous Artists: Gladys Nielsen, Jim Nutt, Joseph Joachim. This at the lower work is one of Martin Ramirez's works. It's very large, over 7 feet in length. And Ramirez was one of the few artists in the American narrative who worked in an institution for people with mental and developmental disabilities. When you look at the history of the reception of this work in Europe, beginning in the late 90s with Hans Prinzhorn, who requires a vast amount of work from institutions and publishers and makes a collection called the Prinzhorn Collection in Heidelberg at a state asylum. The art of the insane, as it was called, or psychotic art, begins to attract the attention of artists. And so from the surrealists, who are very deeply interested in this work, through Dubuffet, whom I mentioned, through Cobra, you can see generation after generation of Europeans embracing work that comes primarily out of institutions. In the US, the demographic of the self-taught artist is very different. It's those on the margins, those who are alienated and don't have access to training, do so because, or don't have access because of reasons of class, of gender, and above all, of race and ethnicity. So it's a different story. And as you'll have noticed when I was talking about some of these artists and identifying them, like Joachim, they're coming to make work only after they've retired, or they've had accidents at work and can no longer work. And their background is that they are African American, artists of color, and they're coming often from small rural communities where the education is very available to them was very limited. And again, just to make the point of the richness of this Chicago context, I'm showing you an example of work by Henry Darger, who is again one of the most admired of self-taught artists in this country, who lived an extremely reclusive life, working in his apartment in Chicago, writing a book of the exploits of the Vivian Girls of some 16,000 pages, and following it with drawings, often of panoramic scale, in which he illustrated the episodes in the ongoing saga of oppression and attack and travail that the Vivian Girls experienced in their search for a better world. Okay. So I want to come back to this question of how do we deal with work by artists who were invisible or erased in different ways from the dominant narratives. As I spoke about it in relation to Trailer, and to say that rather than seeing them as incommensurable and not able to be shown in context, I think if we look more closely, we can see ways that they readily might be linked. And I put together two works made in the early 30s, one by Horace Pippin, who was amongst the group of modern primitives that was in Barr's show in 1938, and put it with a Grant Wood painting to highlight that the wood, there's a kind of faux naive quality to the wood that is very much of the tenor of the time. And though we don't talk about wood as primitivizing, as we might say with Marston Hartley, it's a form of primitivizing. And to look at, and to think about why this kind of childlike, naive style comes to him as something that has resonance at the time. And it's not just because maybe he happens to think that Russo is a great artist. It's because the values that are connected to this kind of naivete speak to an unblemished world, a world of rural harmony, a world that is not impacted by the Industrial Revolution, by the metropolis, by modernity. And so in looking at that work, that's what audiences were responding to. That's not why Pippin, who's untrained, worked in the manner he did. But conversely, he's moving, you could say, in the opposite direction from being seen as a primitive because he constrained by the limitations of not having been taught to draw or not having acquired perspective and the like. Critics began to think that they'd, in a sense, he'd either graduated out of primitivism, like he'd got really good, or they'd made a mistake in categorizing, and really he was he was an artist of a substantial kind. So he goes through this other trajectory, and that the simplifications and abbreviations in his style are seen as deliberate and are part of the kind of eloquence of a scene of great drama, as the buffalo are being, you can see that the buffalo are being herded into this kind of cul-de-sac and turning on the dogs in their immediate vicinity, and the hunter. Yeah, it's quite hard to read today. The painting's darkened and we've lost a lot of detail, but the eloquence of the language for the purposes of his subject is, I think, absolutely commensurate with that you see going on in wood. And maybe that's where I should stop. I think that there's obviously a great deal more to say, but the curatorial questions can in some ways be summarized under a phrase that the art historian and art critic Suzanne Hudson used, which was the dispensation of privilege. And in a way, that's what she's talking. What she's talking about is this is what curators do. Curators make decisions. They're gatekeepers. They let certain work into the institution. They advocate for it. They acquire it. They write it into history. I mean, it's part of a larger art world in which that's reinforced by collectors, by commercial galleries, by critics and the like. But the public face of it is, in a sense, managed in quite large part by curators. And in thinking about the dispensation of privilege, what she's pointing to is the need to think about who is dispensing this privilege? Who are curators? What kind of formations? What kind of demographics do they represent? Who are they making the decisions on behalf of? And for whom? Who are the audiences that are desired or intended? And I think that in looking at the work of self-taught artists of a very wide spectrum, or others that once would have been thought to be on the margins for a variety of reasons, we see this question put in its most acute form. And it's the question that really underlies the debates today around inclusion and diversity as they pertain to the art world. Thank you.